a boy ran down the street.
Former mayor of Nashville, Richard Fulton, died recently at the age of 91. Not only did he serve as a state senator and a United States congressman, he also made a country music record.
Andrew Jackson, for better or worse, became a very important and historic president due to the War of 1812. In fact, without the Battle of New Orleans, there is no Andrew Jackson as President of the United States, which could have changed the entire antebellum history of America at the time.
Not many people can tell you much about the War of 1812, except maybe the year that it started. But historian Tom Kanon can tell us much more than that, such as how Tennessee became the volunteer state, how Native Americans fought on both sides, and how a comet and an earthquake helped launch the war. You'll hear these stories and a lot more on this episode of Nashville Retrospect. Welcome to the Nashville Retrospect podcast. I'm your host, Allen Forkum. I am also the editor and publisher of the Nashville Retrospect, a monthly newspaper full of old news stories from and new essays about Nashville's past. When you pick up a copy of the January 2019 issue, you will see what the Nashville skyline looked like in 1958 and in 1832. You can read original newspaper accounts of General Tom Thumb's visit to Nashville in 1869 and about Richard Fulton being kicked out of the Tennessee State Senate in 1955 for being too young. At a 1905 emancipation celebration, Nashville blacks were warned about the coming Jim Crow laws for streetcars. In 1884, an article recommended melting snow in a glass to see the coal dust filtered from the air by the snow. And in 1835, a newspaper was criticized by local church leaders when it wrote that sectarian religious newspapers, quote, seldom do good and never fail to do harm. In our letters section, you can read comments about the sulfur water fountain that used to be at Worthen Industries on Taylor Street. Quite a few people recalled their parents and grandparents taking them there to fill up jugs.
It was just constantly running. You didn't have to turn a faucet on or anything. And you could smell it about half a block away.
Roger Shirley wrote the original 1982 Nashville Banner story that we republished in the December issue.
There was always a lot of people come up to this water fountain. Lots of people thought it had some miraculous medicinal purposes. People from all walks of life, different income levels, African American, white, business people. It was just really interesting.
At the time, Banner editor Bill Hance had assigned Roger the story. It was about Nashville attorney David Rutherford trying to have the historic Sulphur Spring relocated to nearby Morgan Park.
So David came by. He came by the Banner, and he drove me over to the area and was talking and telling the story. And then I come back to the Banner, and Bill Hance had asked me, well, did you drink the water? And I said, no. And he said, well, you can't do the story unless you drink this water. So I head back over there. I was new to Nashville, and I finally found Worthen Manufacturing, but I couldn't figure out where the water was. So I walked around, asked somebody, went, drank the water. It was just god-awful.
The original story got a strong response from readers in 1982, kind of like it did when we posted it on Facebook.
I remember how many people reacted. I mean, there were people that called in to the newsroom to tell me, oh, hey, what a great story. And I remember, everybody had a story. One guy I talked about, it helped his arthritis. And it was a pretty big reaction for sure.
To see article excerpts and photographs from some of these and other stories, visit our Facebook page. You can pick up the latest issue of the Retrospect for only $1 at local grocery stores and markets. And at NashvilleRetrospect.com, you can order subscriptions and back issues. And be sure to tell your friends and family about this podcast. That's one way to help us continue producing it. Another way is to become a supporter with donations. Just look for the link on the podcast webpage. If you ask Tennesseans what makes January the 8th an important date, you're more likely to be told that it's Elvis Presley's birthday than you are that it is the anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans, a lopsided victory by General Andrew Jackson against the British in the War of 1812. There was a time when Nashville businesses and schools closed on that date, and the state legislature adjourned just to mark the occasion. An 1858 article even refers to the day as immortal in history. But a parody video at the College Humor website captures just how much that immortal date has faded from memory. In a trailer for a made-up movie called The War of 1812, none of the American characters knows why the war is being fought or even who the enemy is.
I have to go.
Where?
Out west. Maybe really far south. It could be Canada.
When will you return?
You know what? I might have to go out to sea.
And if you see an engine, shoot!
Wait, I thought the Indians were on our side.
I thought they were with the British.
Didn't we already fight the British?
We will rise against the British and the Indians and the French. No. Yeah? No, not the French. Not the French! Sorry. Yes, the French. Final answer.
I remember one occasion I was out at the Hermitage doing a talk, and there was a small audience there, and there was a young couple in the front row. And I asked the young lady, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the War of 1812? And she just sat there with a blank look on her face for a lengthy 30 seconds, and then finally said, absolutely nothing came to her mind. So I knew then and there that I had my work cut out for me to try and make this era more palatable to the public and more interesting, as it is for me.
Dr. Tom Kanon has been an archivist at the Tennessee State Library and Archives for 25 years. For 20 of those years, he's also been researching the War of 1812.
At first, I was just like anyone else when I began researching it. What is the War of 1812? Why was it fought? In fact, the only thing I really knew about it was what most people know is the fact that the Battle of New Orleans was fought, and they know something that Andrew Jackson was related to it.
I, of course, knew even less. The Star-Spangled Banner was written during the war. The British burned the White House. That was about it. Fortunately, while doing research for the Nashville Retrospect, I met Tom and began to learn more. I read his book, Tennesseans at War, 1812 to 1815, which I highly recommend. And for the 200th anniversary of the war, Tom wrote a series of articles for the Retrospect, which you can find in back issues listed on the podcast webpage. It's a history that used to be a lot more commonly known.
Up into and through the early part of the 20th century, the War of 1812 was still considered a vital part of the state's history. I discovered in a history textbook of Tennessee, that students, and these were sixth grade students, were supposed to, in one of their exercises, pinpoint all the places on the map where Jackson and his Tennesseans fought in the Creek War. And they were also supposed to, on a sand table, denote where the breastworks were for the Battle of New Orleans and the placement of all the armies. And these were sixth grade children that were supposed to know this. And that was in the 1930s. So by the middle of the 20th century, things start to change a little bit, and I think that's probably due to the advent of the social history that takes place in the 1960s and really takes flight after that. And Jackson, in a sense, becomes vilified for his connection with the Indian Removal Act when he was president and the fact that he was a slave owner. And so when Jackson's reputation sort of takes a nosedive, so does the interest in the War of 1812.
Nonetheless, understanding the War of 1812 really is necessary for understanding Tennessee and American history, whether it's Tennessee's rise to national prominence, or the change in geopolitics after America's defeat of the British, or America's treatment of Native Americans, who lost millions of acres of territory during the war, even though some fought for the United States. To begin with, even though it's been over 200 years, we can still recognize similarities to other American conflicts in more recent history.
One of the main historians of the War of 1812, Don Hickey, has a book called The Forgotten Conflict. And one could say the Korean War measures up to that title as well, simply because the causation factors get mired. No one's exactly sure what caused the War of 1812, what caused the Korean War. In terms of the Vietnam War, the contentiousness, the divisiveness that the Vietnam War caused was very similar to the War of 1812, because the country was clearly divided during the War of 1812. You had a large majority of people who did not want to go to war, particularly in the New England states, whereas you did mostly in the western states. And that's one thing your listeners have to remember, is that Tennessee at that time was considered a western state. And the Westerners had the notion that we had been insulted by the British with their maritime restrictions.
The British Navy needed sailors for its ongoing war with France, so it used its superior power to board American merchant ships and force American sailors to work on British ships. One source puts the number of impressed American sailors at 15,000 by 1812. I mean, that's I would say the sailors' impressment is a legitimate issue, but why a war? Were the British near? Were they physically near? I know that.
No, not at all. In fact, the British were busy, if you will, fighting a brutal war with Napoleon at the time, and had been for a decade prior to the War of 1812. That's one of the reasons I think that Americans took on Britain, is that they figured we could defeat them because Britain's too busy fighting Napoleon. We'll get them when they're at their weakest. And the best way we can get at Britain was through Canada, which was one of their provinces. And there was some talk, by the way, of annexing Canada should we take it over, which we never did. And to this day, Canadians always look at the War of 1812 as a war of American aggression. That's how they sometimes subtitle it. And to a large degree, they're correct, that we were planning on, of course, defeating the British there in Canada and perhaps taking the country over and annexing it to the United States. So Britain's involved in a war to the death with Napoleon's forces. And America is trading with both sides. And Britain and France put restrictions on trade so that we don't help the other's enemy. We put our own restrictions on trade, which in turn hurt our economy more than it hurt the European economy, because we knew we didn't have enough military might to take on Britain, at least not in the beginning. And this is around 1808, 1809 that we're talking about now. But things start to change a little bit when the so-called war hawks begin to make themselves heard in Congress. And their rhetoric is full of Anglophobic sentiments. They accused the Britain of impressing our seamen, which they had done, of restricting our trade. And it was akin, you might say, to being bullied. We're the new kid on the block as a fledgling nation, and here's one of the mightiest military and naval powers in the world. And we have the temerity to declare war on them because our national pride and honor has been insulted. Honor is a word that comes up time after time in the rhetoric of the pro-war Americans at that time. And we weren't about to take it anymore. Men like Felix Grundy, who was a congressman from Tennessee, and George Washington Campbell, who was senator at the time, and they pushed for the War of 1812 so vociferously that there was a saying amongst the anti-war detractors that the War of 1812 was begun by James Madison, Felix Grundy, and the devil.
Why was the war opposed by anyone in America, much less the New Englanders?
Well, the New Englanders particularly, because they were the ones who stood to lose the most in terms of the trade that was going on. You have to remember that our largest trading partner prior to the War of 1812 was, in fact, Great Britain. Ironically, it remained that after the War of 1812, too. Those were the people that were buying our raw materials, our foodstuff, our goods, and in turn we were getting their finished products, manufactured goods, from them. So New England, from their point of view, because they had all the major ports of trade, shipping ports, stood to lose a lot by declaring war against their biggest customer, so to speak. So they were not in favor of it. And obviously there were practical reasons, one being how could we possibly defeat Great Britain, who had one of the largest armies in the world at the time. And they just thought that there was no need to do that. These, after all, were people who spoke the same language as us, had basically the same customs, and they were our trading partners. Why would you want to ruin all that just for the sake of a national honor?
The War of 1812 was not known as the War of 1812 until decades after its conclusion. At the time, it was often referred to as the Second Revolutionary War.
The War of 1812 relation to the American Revolution is very strong because you have a generation in the American Revolution who passes the torch, if you will, to the next generation. And that generation is the generation of the War of 1812. Now, that's a pretty tough act to follow, the Founding Fathers generation. And in my opinion, the War of 1812 generation is seeking their own identity while trying to emulate the exploits of their fathers. And what better way to do that than to take on the same enemy that their fathers did in the American Revolution. Now, it's obviously a little bit more complicated than that, but that is certainly one of the main factors in my research, at least, of the War of 1812, is that strong connection to the American Revolution.
Protecting the lives of our sailors and the honor of our founding fathers weren't the only motivations for the pro-war side. As an indication of the culture of the time, some Tennesseans saw signs of war in natural phenomena, such as the New Madrid earthquakes, which were so powerful they caused the Mississippi River to flow backwards.
The New Madrid earthquakes occur in December of 1811 and then continue on in through February of 1812. A lot of seismic activity is going on, and many people took it as a sign from God of his anger. And it was preceded in the fall of 1811 by a comet that could be seen through the skies. And of course, a comet traditionally, biblically, has always been a portent of bad things to come. It was an ill omen. So people started putting two and two together and thinking, well, it's inevitable that war must be on the horizon. And it's my contention that with that attitude in mind, it was easier to declare war when it seemed to a lot of people that it was ordained to happen in the first place. And the earthquakes at that time, and certainly the comet too, made that a reality.
After the declaration of war in June 1812, the United States Regular Army prepared for the fight, and each of the 18 states were also expected to form militias from the general population for the purpose of defending their own states.
Free males between the ages of 18 and 45 were required to belong to the state militia. Now, one could join what was called the U.S. Regular Army, and these would have been the soldiers that would have had uniforms, been given arms, etc. But the militia were required to bring their own arms and their own uniforms and their own gunpowder, etc. Many of them simply didn't have that. So it was more of a straw army. It wasn't exactly something that could be depended on. At the time of the War of 1812, there were approximately 29,000 males that were in the state militia. And people have asked me, well, how many Tennesseans fought in the War of 1812? And my best estimation would be about 15,000, perhaps, at some time or another, served during the War of 1812. And that may be an inflated figure, or it may be even a little bit larger. It's hard to determine because there were frequent reenlistments. They would serve for 3 months or 6 months, and then they would go home and then sign up again for another tour of duty. So many of the men served more than one tour of duty.
Tell us what these men would have looked like clothing-wise. Were they expected to bring their own equipment, their own?
Yes, the militia laws specified certain clothing and certain arms. But what's fascinating about the War of 1812, in my research at least, is that the myth of the sharpshooting Tennessee riflemen is simply that, a myth. In fact, many of these men came into the service without any arms at all. Throughout the war, arms had to be confiscated from the general populace to make up the ranks. The men basically, in my conclusion, sort of wore whatever they had. Basically, you had the hunting shirt was certainly one of the most popular attires, and they would always be carrying knives, tomahawks, which I think is interesting, and muskets or rifles. All kinds of shapes of hats. There are descriptions in the Battle of New Orleans campaign by Britishers who captured Americans, and they're fascinated by the way these men looked because they had no real uniforms per se. And they would describe them in various details. And one would get the idea that there was no uniformity to the uniforms. They simply wore what they had, whether it be a long coat, a short coat, frock. One soldier is described as having long hair down to his shoulders, with a conical hat and a long coat. And another Britisher said they just looked like a bunch of farmers to him, the way they were dressed.
In Tennessee, there were 2 divisions of militias. The 2nd Division was commanded by Andrew Jackson, a former Nashville attorney.
By the first decade of the 19th century, he was more of a gentleman planter at this stage. Now, how he gets involved in militia is very simple, because he is the major general of the 2nd Division of the Tennessee militia. There are 2 divisions, East and West. Even that gets complicated because what was then called West Tennessee is now really Middle Tennessee. So whenever I refer to West Tennessee, we're talking about what is now the counties that comprise Middle Tennessee. But there are 2 divisions of militia, and he was the major general of the 2nd Division, or West Militia. So obviously, he was the one to go to should they require any troops.
Why is he the major general of the militia? In other words, is it because of his station as a planter? Is it because of, had he done earlier work, militia work? Was he ever just a soldier and then worked as...
No, Jackson's career as a military man was very, very limited to just a brief episode in the American Revolution where he was not even really a militiaman. He was just a courier. His 2 brothers died during the American Revolution. Of course, his mother died of disease during the Revolution. But he had no military experience. It was strictly a station of honor. He was a person of note by the early 1800s. And the way officers were elected in the militia was through other officers. So anything above the rank of captain, those officers elected other officers. Captains were elected by the rank and file. So it was more of an honorary title than anything he had ever done militarily, that's for sure.
So it's that to me is interesting because you kind of have this push for a war, you have a declaration of war, you have, I guess it's not derogatory to say, a kind of ragtag bunch of soldiers that this planter is going to be in charge of. Is that a fair characterization? That
Yes. I mean, the training of the militia was very, very limited. Once or twice a year, they would get together on a muster ground and go through the motions of parading around and trying to have some drills. But basically, someone would always bring a barrel of whiskey around, and it turned out to be somewhat of a celebratory occasion. And local politicians would come to canvass the area and solicit votes. So there was very little military training going on. You might brush up on a military handbook, but that was about the extent of it. So Jackson, when he did get into war, faced an army that was totally undisciplined, and that was one of the factors that plagued him throughout the War of 1812.
I know one thing that we've discussed sometimes, because I, in working on the retrospect, run across these stories, was the hunt for deserters. How does that look at that time? In 1812, you talked about the war being the Second American Revolution and the importance of fighting the British again, and yet there were a number of deserters, long lists of them in the paper where reward is being offered. What's going on there?
Well, very simply, the volunteer spirit in the state was strong, but most of the militia laws required that a service would only be for 3 months tour of duty. There were different acts that were passed by the U.S. Congress at the onset of the war, volunteer acts. Some prescribed 6 months, some prescribed 1 year. But most of the militia in most of the states, it was a 3-month tour of duty. And these soldiers, once they felt that their tour of duty was over, they were ready to go home. Jackson didn't quite see it that way. He claimed that their 3 months was not up, and there was obviously disputes about that. And so there was mass desertions in the winter or December of 1813. And there's the famous story where Jackson literally held the men at bay with threat of cannon fire, which is true. And because of the difference in enlistment laws, it was always foggy about how long these men were supposed to have served. But regardless, Jackson felt, or at least he mentioned in one letter, that even if technically their tour of duty was over, he thought it was their duty to stay and help fight and see the war to its end. Well, most of the Tennesseans who had families at home and farms to run businesses didn't quite see it that way. So consequently, you had these mass quote-unquote desertions, but in actuality, the men didn't look at it as desertion. They looked at it like they had done their duty, and they were simply going home.
Understandably, history books tend to focus on the major battles and the decisive moments that determine the course of history. And though Tennessee's volunteers would play a big role in such battles, it wasn't their only challenge.
The one thing that the Tennesseans did mostly during the war is march, unless they were mounted men, of course. And what few diaries there are that exist from the war, letters, etc., they're always talking about how difficult the terrain was to traverse. And the constant marching took its toll, not only physically, but I think in attitude, too. Because as in most wars, you'll have a few hours of intense combat, and that punctuates a long spell of just inactivity and boredom.
While Americans were fighting the British and their Indian allies in the north on the Canadian frontier, Jackson and his Tennesseans were put to the test with a long, arduous journey from Nashville south into the Mississippi Territory. They camped for weeks near Natchez, prepared to protect New Orleans should the British attack it. Jackson got his famous nickname soon after.
In the spring of 1813, when Jackson's army had marched down to the Natchez region to be prepared to fight in the region of New Orleans and Mobile, but they never got called down there to do that. So Jackson was told to march his men back home, which he did, and he acquires the name Old Hickory along the way, supposedly, because of his stubbornness to take that on There are other stories that involve how he got that nickname, but quite frankly, I've never seen a primary source that says why he got it or how he got it, and if he got it during that expedition. But he was, in fact, called Old Hickory after that time, because I have seen newspaper accounts that refer to him as Old Hickory.
Though the Natchez expedition ultimately served no military purpose, it wasn't long before the Tennessee militia would face combat, but not with the British. They would fight in a war within a war. An Indian attack on a white settlement became the catalyst.
That was the straw that broke the camel's back. The so-called massacre at Fort Mims, which was a settlement north of Mobile in Alabama in August of 1813, in which 250 settlers were killed by the Creek faction, the warlike faction known as the Red Sticks. And one should always differentiate between the Creek Indians and the Red Sticks, because there was actually a contingent of Creeks that sided with the Americans during the Creek War. So the Red Sticks were the warlike faction. And after the massacre in August of 1813, Tennessee sees the writing on the wall. Actually, they see more of an opportunity, because as I explained in my book at great length, there's a lot of economics to the Creek War, simply in the fact that we wanted the Creek land so that we could have access to their river systems, to the Gulf of Mexico for trade purposes. But we declare war in September of 1813 against the Creeks. It's interesting that when we declare war, we say it's for defensive purposes. We're going to defend our state, because technically the state of Tennessee could not declare war on Indian nations. Only the federal government could do that. So they declare war by saying it's a defensive action, but in effect, we go down and take offensive actions against the Creeks on the excuse that we're protecting our frontiers.
So a preemptive strike.
Yes, yes.
And had there been, this was after Fort Mims, but had there been any rumors or news that there were attacks planned on the Tennessee frontier?
Well, there are always rumors. So that was one thing that the Tennesseans on the frontier were paranoid about, was any sort of Indian uprising. And there had been isolated incidents prior to this that leaned toward that. There was one specific incident in May of 1812 called the murders on the Duck River in Tennessee, in which a small party of Red Sticks attacked a settlement, a small settlement with just a few families, and massacred several Tennesseans, including children, and they took prisoner one of the females, Martha Crawley. And that incident alone sparked paranoia and anger and vengeance on the part of Tennesseans. And that comes right before the declaration of the War of 1812, and it sort of played into it. So there had been several incidents leading up to the Creek War, always rumors circulating. In fact, after Mims, there was a huge panic, a literal panic, throughout what is now Alabama, which was then called the Mississippi Territory. Whole settlements just abandoning their farms and towns, thinking that the Red Sticks, the Creeks, had formed a war party of 10,000 Indians, and they were going to come up through the Mississippi Territory up into Tennessee and massacre all the whites. And these rumors were believed to be true, which harkens back to the old Indian wars of the post-revolution.
Yeah, so there was some experience, some fear to play on there, I guess. They were ripe for that sort of
Oh yes, most definitely.
Story.
And actually, the vengeance that the Tennesseans enacted during this Creek War verifies that, because the word exterminate comes up a lot, annihilate, destroy. It was not just about defeating the Creeks. It was about total destruction, and in the process, make it easier for the United States to obtain the lands that the Creeks inhabited.
Tennesseans had fought both with and against Indians prior to 1812 during the settlement period of Nashville. You can hear more about the Indian Wars in Episode 5 in our interview with historian Paul Clements. But by 1812, what did a war with Indians have to do with the British? In our January issue, you can read an 1808 article from a Nashville paper that gives some indication. That paper's editor had spoken with a man visiting Nashville from Detroit, who brought news of Indians surrounding an American fort there. 200 Indian warriors were, he said, all armed and supported at the expense of the British.
There was friction on the frontier between the Native Americans and the white Americans, which led to different skirmishes and conflicts prior to the war. And the fact that the white Americans blamed the British for all this is interesting, because the British occupied Canada at the time, and the white Americans were claiming that the British were instigating the Indians all along the frontier, which wasn't really true, but it gave the Americans an excuse to foment a war against the Native Americans. Whenever there's Indian unrest on the frontier, the British are blamed for it. The same thing with the Creek War. The Creek Indian Nation, basically in Alabama and Georgia, begin to revolt, shall we say, against American incursion on their land and customs and ways. And naturally, the Tennesseans think that the British are behind it. So it becomes integral to the War of 1812. But that particular conflict, that is, as I have mentioned in my book, for most Tennesseans, the Creek War is the War of 1812, because that's the conflict in which most Tennesseans fought. They always had the attitude that we're basically on our own out here. And that stems back to the post-revolutionary Indian Wars, where the Westerners were constantly asking the federal government for help in the form of troop or supplies. They never got it, so they took matters into their own hands, defeated the Native Americans, and that gave them a sense of independence, and it also made them realize that if we're going to do things, we're going to have to do it on our own.
Jackson and his Tennessee militia fought a number of battles against the Red Sticks in the Creek War. Most of the battles took place in the northern part of today's Alabama, such as Talladega. The most significant of these clashes came to be known as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend.
The major battle takes place on March 27, 1814, at a place called Horseshoe Bend. There's a national military park there today. Very fascinating place. If your listeners ever get a chance to go there, please do. On that day, March 27, 1814, nearly 900 Creek warriors lost their lives, which is considered to be the largest loss of life of Native Americans in North American history. And Jackson was at the head of that army. And that was the final death blow to the Red Stick faction.
And just for context, because I know it was the case in the Battle of New Orleans, but were there Native Americans fighting with Andrew Jackson even at that battle?
Yes, most definitely. As a matter of fact, the army that Jackson had at Horseshoe Bend somewhat mirrored the army he later had at New Orleans, in that he had volunteers, he had militia, he had U.S. regular army troops, and he had a contingent of allied Native Americans, about 500 Cherokee warriors and 100 friendly, quote-unquote, Creek warriors that fought against the Red Sticks. So the army then that Jackson had at New Orleans mirrored that, in the sense that there were militia, volunteers, there were U.S. regulars, and there was even a small party of Choctaw Indians that were with Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans.
The defeat of the Red Sticks marked the end of the Creek War and led to a treaty, one in which millions of acres of land were lost by the Creek Indians. Tom contends this treaty radically changed the United States' relationship with Native Americans.
The Treaty of Fort Jackson occurs in early August of 1814, in which Jackson, who is representing the United States' interest in it, collects a number of Creek chiefs, only one or two of which are Red Sticks, by the way. And he forces them to sign a treaty that relinquishes 22 million acres of Creek territory. So in effect, Jackson has succeeded in obtaining what Tennesseans have wanted all along, is to get a good portion of the Creek territory. The way the treaty was conducted in the terms of dictation rather than negotiation strikes me as being a major switch in Indian treaties for the future, because up to that time there had always been this give and take with the Indians, some negotiation going on. But in this case, at the Treaty of Fort Jackson, Jackson simply dictating the terms, you have to accept it, sign on the dotted line, that's it. And that set a precedent for future Indian treaties, and in my opinion, starts the first step on the road to eventual Indian removal by the 1830s.
That would be kind of like an unconditional surrender, I guess.
Yes. Yes, the Creeks were blamed for creating this war, the Creek War. You started it. You were the ones who massacred these people on the Duck River, who took Martha Crawley prisoner, etc. And now you have to pay for it. You have to pay for that. At least that was how they justified it.
And so by then, he's not Major General of the U.S. Regulars at that point.
He is.
He is.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
So he is acting under the
Yes, he is acting under U.S.
authority.
Yes.
Okay.
At first, they did not want Jackson, they being the federal government under the Madison administration, they did not want Jackson to be part of those proceedings. But through outside pressure, they relinquished and allowed him to be the head of negotiations.
During this time, the British successfully attacked and burned Washington, D.C., a humiliating loss for the United States. Great Britain then turned its attention to the South, to Florida and Louisiana. Adopting a strategy used in Canada, they allied themselves with refugee Creek Indians. Jackson would have notable victories against the British in such places as Mobile Point and Pensacola, but the main battle was to take place at New Orleans. Even though Jackson was by then Major General of the U.S. Regular Army, he continued to rely on his Tennessee volunteers.
When he goes to New Orleans, he does have the U.S. regulars at his disposal, which weren't all that prevalent, but he calls on his reliable Tennesseans to make up the bulk of the army down there, under the command of William Carroll. Some of them were veterans of the Creek War, yes, but some weren't. But these are the people that Jackson relied on, interestingly enough. He felt that they were the ones that would follow him into battle, even though I'm sure a lot of them did not like Jackson throughout the Creek War. In fact, Jackson was vilified by many of the soldiers as being too harsh, too disciplinarian. In one instance, right before the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, he had a soldier executed. And so incidents like that didn't play well with the untrained, undisciplined Tennesseans.
When Jackson arrived at New Orleans, almost 15,000 British soldiers and sailors were on ships in the Gulf of Mexico, waiting for opportunities to attack the city, which they took on multiple occasions.
The Battle of New Orleans is actually a campaign for New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans is comprised of 4 different engagements. If you look at the sequence of battles, by December of 1814, the British are intending to take the city of New Orleans. Jackson comes along with his makeshift army of Tennesseans, regulars, Louisiana militia, Mississippi Territory volunteers, etc. And he makes a defensive stand just south of the city. The first engagement takes place on the evening of December 23rd. Then there are 2 subsequent engagements. But the Battle of New Orleans occurs on January 8th, 1815. And that, of course, is the battle that has become famous in song, story, legend. It's interesting to note that the the Battle of New Orleans song was a #1 hit on Billboard in 1959, Johnny Horton's big hit, so any baby boomer who's out there will remember that song, which I always thought curious that the legacy of that war and the battle would extend that far into the future. But there were so many myths, stories, uncorroborated stories that came out of that battle because it was so lopsided. And by lopsided, I mean that over 2,000 British soldiers were either killed, wounded, or captured, as opposed to only 13 Americans and about 50 wounded or captured Americans. So the lopsidedness of that battle alone made it almost unbelievable to most Americans, particularly when they thought that the British were going to take the city over, that Jackson would not be able to defend the surrounding area. And so he fooled everybody. Now, there was a lot of blundering on the part of the British as well, but Jackson's defensive strategy was strong, and he had artillery power that proved to be devastating to the attacking British troops on the morning of January 8th. But there have been so many stories passed on that when I did the chapters on the battle for my book, I had to really sift through a lot of things that I couldn't corroborate, and I wouldn't put them in the book unless I knew they were factual. And so a lot of stories that were apocryphal, that could have been very entertaining, I kept out for that reason, because I always thought that truth was better than fiction anyway. And there's just incidents of heroism galore that abound through there on both sides, the British and Americans. And it's just a fascinating battle to examine in detail.
Do you have a rough idea of what the numbers were going into the battle for each side?
Roughly about 6,000 or 7,000 on each side. Curiously, each side thought the other had much more. There were inflated figures coming into the American lines that the British had anywhere up to 30,000 troops available. And the British thought that the Americans had much more than what we had, probably because there was really no effective way of spying on the other side, no effective reconnaissance. But figures vary depending on what source you read, but roughly there was about 6,000 or 7,000 on each side. So it was fairly evenly matched, even though at the time the Americans liked to say that they were outnumbered 5-1 or something like that.
But they in reality weren't.
No, they weren't.
Yeah.
No, and they were in a defensive position, which, as anyone knows in battle, is always more advantageous when the numbers are even.
Jackson became so famous after the Battle of New Orleans that even some of his Tennessee troops began to view him in a different light.
Anyone who was associated with Jackson became a hero, and so they cherished being associated with Jackson. So soldiers that had vilified him a year or two earlier now were proud to say, yes, I was with Jackson in New Orleans. That was always a badge of honor to declare that, yes, you had been at New Orleans with Jackson. In fact, I always found it amusing that when I would look at pension files from this time period, I would see something written by the soldiers, the veterans, saying, I was with Jackson at New Orleans. And then I would check his service record, and in fact, he was not with Jackson at New Orleans. But it was considered to be, that was the thing you wanted to be with. It was if you could say you're with Jackson, New Orleans, you were in. Much like people would say they were at Woodstock back in '69. Even though there were 500,000 people there, there's probably 1 million people who said they were there. It's the same thing with the Battle of New Orleans. You can't imagine the magnitude of unbelievability and celebration that took place after this battle. No one could believe it, that not only did we defeat the British, but in such an uneven way that Jackson and Tennessee, by the way, becomes a hero. And now Tennesseans are looked upon a little bit differently by the rest of the nation. We're no longer these backwoodsmen. We're now people to be reckoned with. We beat the mightiest army in Europe, Wellington's forces. And so we get a reputation, perhaps unfounded, but nevertheless we get a reputation as being people that you could rely on, that were independent-minded, would stick up for themselves, and don't mess with Tennessee.
I asked Tom what he thought was the importance of Jackson's victory at New Orleans and, ultimately, of America's victory in the War of 1812.
In terms of importance, without that battle, Jackson probably just goes home and becomes, a big name in Tennessee and an important, maybe political person in the state, and certainly a wealthy planter. But he's not going to the White House without the Battle of New Orleans. And it skyrocketed the career of a lot of different men. William Carroll, who I mentioned before, he later becomes governor of Tennessee 6 times, served governor more than any other, served more terms than any other governor since then. John Coffey, who was Andrew Jackson's right-hand man, totally lost to history. It was a very important person. He was not a political personality. He liked to stay behind the scenes. He was more of a land speculator. He later returns to Alabama, becomes one of the wealthiest individuals in the state, practically creates the town of Florence, Alabama, where he's buried today. And you had anybody who was connected with that battle, as I said before, they're considered to be very special people. Of the 95 counties that are in the state of Tennessee, nearly 1/3 of them are named after people who were affiliated in one way or another with the War of 1812. And of course, our nickname, the Volunteer State, stems directly from the era of the War of 1812.
Today, we're used to getting international news almost at the speed of light, delivered directly to devices in our pockets. Back then, the fact that news traveled so slowly not only affected the war, but it gave us one of the war's great ironies.
Well, it played a very important part in the war because, as many people probably know, the peace treaty was signed before the Battle of New Orleans was fought. In the Belgian village of Ghent, American and British delegates came to an agreement, signed a peace treaty on December 24 of 1814. But the treaty had to be ratified by both sides before the war could officially come to an end. Communications being as slow as they were back then, it took time for the news of that treaty to get to the United States. In fact, the news of the Treaty of Ghent did not arrive in the United States until early February of 1815. That's how slow communications were. So had there been a telegraph of some sort, he could have wired over, the peace treaty has been signed, there probably would not have been no Battle of New Orleans, which means there probably, again, wouldn't have been no Andrew Jackson as president, and no Tennessee taking the spotlight for the nation at the time.
I also asked Tom if he had a favorite story from his research of Tennesseans in the War of 1812, and he had one directly related to Nashville.
It was taken from a memoir of one of the soldiers who fought during the war, and his name was Andrew Jackson Edmonston. He's from Davidson County, and he fought throughout the entire war. He enters as a private and comes out as a lieutenant by the end of the war. He's during the Creek War, he's at the Battle of New Orleans, and he tells about a story that when he's coming home from the campaign at New Orleans, he, unlike most of the men, he had a horse that he could ride on. And as he's coming back up the trace, he happens to run into an old school chum of his named Samuel Hope, who he meets along the way. But Samuel Hope is dying. He's very sickly. What I mentioned before about most of the casualties being from disease. Samuel Hope is sickly, and he tells Edmonston that he doesn't think he's going to make it. Could he please take him along? Well, Edmonston puts Hope on his horse, and he walks alongside the horse and takes hope back all the way to Davidson County. And I write about it in the book, and I'd like to just read an extract if I might. For most soldiers, it was enough just to have made it home. Lieutenant Edmonston, still trudging beside his slow-moving horse, carrying the sickly Samuel Hope, approached his family's residence near Nashville unannounced early one morning. Edmonston eagerly climbed the fence and observed some of his family walking in the yard. No one noticed him until he fired his pistol in the air. His sisters and parents ran to him, rejoicing over his safe return. Edmonston later recorded, "None but them that have gone through just such a scrape as we had can tell how we all felt. For myself, I was fully paid for all my trials. My dear old mother hung on my neck. I was her youngest." And when I read that, I realized that could have been written during any conflict. The universality of a young soldier coming home and having his mother run out and hugging him around the neck just struck a nerve with me that this was something real. These people were just like us. Their motivations may have been different due to the environment that they lived in and the culture at the time, but like any human being, they're a part of a drama, part of a saga that war always brings out, because what greater drama is there than a life or death situation? And I further began to realize that Edmonston represented Tennessee in a way, because he went in at a very young age, at 18, as a young man who, by his own admission, was something of a mama's boy. At least that's what he said his father called him when he joined. But by the time he came back in 1815, he saw that his father had a newfound respect for him. And in fact, he had become a man. And I began to equate that to Tennessee. They began the war as a young adult, and they came out of it with a sense of identity, a sense of manhood, if you will.
Our thanks to Tom Kanon for the interview. He is finalizing a second book about the War of 1812, one that focuses on the culture and society of the time, as opposed to the battles and politics. It will be titled, "Then Conquer We Must," which is a line from the Star-Spangled Banner. As for Nashville sites to visit today related to the War of 1812, Tom recommends Andrew Jackson's home, the Hermitage, which annually hosts a Battle of New Orleans Day. The Tennessee State Museum and the Tennessee State Library and Archives also have items related to Andrew Jackson and the War of 1812.
I sent you a dozen yellow roses. You'd as soon have flowers on the wall.
Richard Fulton is well known in Nashville for being a recent mayor of the city, and also for serving as a United States congressman and a Tennessee state senator. Less well known is that the Democratic politician also cut a country music record. An announcement in the January 11, 1968 Nashville Tennessean said that U.S. Representative Richard Fulton would be at the Kane Sloan department store to autograph copies of his new 45 RPM record, described as, quote, the congressman's first try in the professional music world. The two songs on the record have that Nashville sound popular at the time. You just heard a sample of A Dozen Yellow Roses, but the flip side, Poor Little Paper Boy, was the main song. The record sleeve features a photo of Fulton hailing a paperboy in front of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. I'm partial to the Paperboy song, mostly because it's about the newspaper business. You can hear more of that song after the end of this episode. In a 1976 Billboard magazine article, Fulton said he recorded the songs in about an hour and a half at Starday Studios, made a little over $1,000, and got to sing it on the Grand Ole Opry. Both songs were written and produced by Reverend John Bozeman, Jr., a Methodist minister and longtime friend of Fulton and his family. In a tragic footnote to the record, Bozeman drowned in a boating accident on Percy Priest Lake in January 1970. Fulton's 18-year-old son, Barry, also drowned in the accident. You can read more about Fulton and his record in the January 2019 issue, in the article by Clinton J. Holloway, to whom we are grateful for loaning us his record. In the same issue, you can read about Fulton's first foray into politics in 1955. Richard Fulton died on November 28, 2018, at the age of 91. Thank you for listening to this episode of Nashville Retrospect. For more information about the stories you heard, including photographs, see the show notes on the podcast webpage, which you can find a link to at NashvilleRetrospect.com. You can also email your comments and suggestions to nashretroshow@gmail.com. This show was written and produced by me, Allen Forkum. Stay tuned for the next one, and in the meantime, don't forget to pick up your copy of the Nashville Retrospect.
Paper boy ran down the street. Torn were his overalls, bare were his feet. Please buy a paper, 2 nickels, he said. My mother's homesick and my father is dead. How many paper boys have you passed by, hungry and cold, left out to cry? Please buy a paper, 2 nickels, that's all. It rings in my ear, the paper boys call.
You know, friends, most of us have so much that sometimes we fail to see the people in this old world not as lucky as you and me. There are kids the whole world over, like that paper boy on the street. Kids who go to bed each night without enough to eat.
How many paper boys have you passed by, hungry and cold, left out to cry? Please buy a paper, 2 nickels, that's all. I'll never